and welcome to the first talk of this year's ExiliCon. I am dead on my feet, so this may not go very well. However, so stories and folk idiom. I will start with an actual story, since that seems to be a good starting point from which to have something to talk about. So it came to pass in a land a long time ago that there were 3 kingdoms on an island. One was the kingdom of Taron, whose king was old and wise. Taron, a land of plenty, a land of peace. The second was the land of Queen Arya, and she and her people were given to war. They were hardy people, a people of the mountains. And the third kingdom, perhaps it's said to be the greatest kingdom, perhaps said to be the richest. But I do not know the name of the ruler of that kingdom. And if I did, I would not tell you. For it came to pass on the island so many years ago that there was a great dragon who visited the island. A great and evil dragon. A dragon dark and malevolent. A dragon cunning and vicious. A dragon great and powerful with wings that could block out the sun. And the dragon flew through. But this was not merely the sort of dragon that would eat crops, burn fields. This was a dragon that was cunning. This was a dragon that wanted to hear suffering. And so the dragon came to the land of King Tauron. Flew over, its wings blocked out the sun, and then thud, it landed with a slap down next to the little castle in which King Tauron lived. And the dragon said to the king, I will destroy all that you have, all of your land, all of your people, unless you make my choice. And the choice is this. You must either give up all of the swords in your kingdom, or the axes, all the spears, all of the weapons, or you must give up all of the gold in your kingdom, all of the riches, all of the wealth, every gemstone, every coin. Or you must give up all of the stories in your kingdom. That is your choice. And Tauron thought, and he thought, and a day and a night passed, and he came out, and he said to the dragon, very well, my kingdom is rich, my kingdom is a kingdom of peace, we will take our swords. And so they did. Every sword, every axe, thrown into a well, reforged, many of them just left to rot, thrown deep into the darkest seas. Needless to say, the warriors of the kingdom were not very happy about this. As you could hear from the thundering of their feet upon the ground above. And so they got together and they talked, and they talked, and they drove themselves into a rage. And they armed themselves with what they could, no swords and no spears, but clubs and fire. And when King Tauron returned from a journey one day, his palace was in ruins, his family scattered, his horses dead in the stable, and it seemed that his kingdom had come to ruin. But over time, day by day, they still had their wealth, and they regrew. The crops slowly began to sprout again. Carts slowly began to roll back into the towns again. And Tauron remained king for many years. But the dragon flew on into the mountains. Run. And the dragon came to the palace of Queen Arya in the Mountain Kingdom, and with a thud, the dragon landed by the castle, and the dragon gave to Arya the choice. All of your wealth, all of your swords, all of your stories. Which will you give up? Which will you choose? You must make the choice. And Arya thought for a day, and Arya thought for a night, and when dawn came, she went out of the castle and she said to the dragon, "Very well, we are a proud people. We are a people driven to war, but we cannot fight you. And so we will give up our gold." And every piece of gold was melted or thrown into the rivers, into the lakes, deep into the caverns beneath the darkest mountain tops. And so the merchants of that kingdom left, one by one, seeking pastures new. And poor that kingdom became, poor and downtrodden. People could not buy the things they needed. But as time went on, they were a proud people. They still had their swords, they still had their pride, they remained. They built, they grew. And Arya, over time, remained queen and saw many things still happen to her kingdom. And the dragon flew on to the third kingdom that may have been the greatest of them all. The most powerful, the most wealthy, the strongest. But I do not know the name of the ruler of that kingdom. And if I did, because I am, after all, a storyteller, I would not tell you. For the dragon asked the king, the nameless king, his question: all of your gold, all of your swords, all of your stories. And as you can probably guess, the king made his choice. He wanted to be the king of a strong kingdom. He wanted to be the king of a wealthy kingdom. And he saw no need for stories. And so they took the storytellers of that kingdom and they cut out their tongues, every one. Cut by cut by cut. But we do not know what happened to that kingdom afterwards, because there are no stories. But if any did filter out, if any storytellers escaped, the one thing you can be sure of, as sure as you are of your life, is that no storyteller would tell a tale from that forgotten kingdom. And so, cross a merchant if you must, though they will leave you poor, and cross a swordsman if you will, though they can hurt you sore. But if remembered you would be by truth or tale or lie, then never cross a teller friend, your memories can die. So, that is a traditional tale that is about 2.5 years old. And so what I want to talk about, I suppose, for the remainder of the session is what the sort of devices are that give the depth of the story. In fact, I could have made it sound even more like a traditional tale. First point, by anchoring it more in pseudo-reality. It sounds slightly more fantasy because I used Talon and Arya, which I just made up off the top of my head. But I could easily have told the same story and told you it was about Saxons and Vikings, and done it in a way that could have plausibly sounded like someone wrote it down much more in the Middle Ages. So that's one thing. Rooting things in the cultural context people know gives a lot of strength to how much depth the story feels to have to them. If instead of a dragon, I'd had something more out of the wall and off the window, if it had been a Jabberwock, then you would have been able to tell that it was only so old. Or indeed, if I picked up some piece of Chinese or Aboriginal myth, if I'd thrown in Biri Inabako, the great giant of Somali mythology, then it would start jarring because people aren't used to seeing those cultural elements together. It's often very useful to throw cultural elements together when writing bits of fantasy, but it means when you do it within the stories, it can be more difficult. One of the other things, simplified characters, but characters that do have something about them. The two characters, or the three characters, the dragon, the kings, that I had in the story, they all basically had about one salient feature, and there wasn't really anything else to them. Which is something that where people write earlier backstories for their fantasy work, it's something that people do actually get wrong sometimes. In that there's often a temptation to say, I'm writing the sort of ancient history and myths of this people, so they're their great mythological hero and I need to tell you everything about them. Actually, you don't. Generally, it's a salient feature. Often it's what I refer to as a heroic method if they're the hero. Basically, the single thing that defines most heroes in mythology is they have a thing or a way that they solve problems, and that's one of the things that characterises them. Either they're the brave guy, or they're the cunning guy, or they're the person who has sewing needles and sticks with the eyes of giants. There's a selling point somewhere. Which is quite important to get. One of the other things is, in terms of story arc, trios are powerful. People have always used them. It will always sound more traditional if you use 3 than if you use another number for the sake of it. There have to be 3 kings in this case. 7 is also a memorable number, but you'd have lost track by 7. 3 is generally the right number to go for. And the other thing with storytelling is much greater use of repetition than you would have in a piece of prose work. If I wrote that down, I wanted it to sell as a novella, I would not keep repeating phrases about, thought for a day, thought for a night, which the monarchs did, or I wouldn't keep sort of just hammering in the singular individual features of those. So that's something that is quite a feature of traditional storytelling, because when you're producing these sorts of works orally, you need to keep hitting things into people's head much more, because they're not getting any more visual reinforcement as you do when you read a book. Which is also another reason for keeping characters relatively simplified. You don't want to make a character too complex in these circumstances. If the character is too complex, people they don't lock into the character so well. They need to just think, this character, therefore I expect this. Boom. Usually that goes for physical as well as sort of style attributes. So I didn't use much in that particular story, but Tauron's beard, for example, or as people find out if they're there when I get around to finishing my telling of Night in the Panther Skin, which is something I'm currently working on, which mine's going to be there for at least. Then for that, one simplifying feature I put in is that all 3 of the main knights in the story, again, there are 3, it's an oral work originally, I've actually assigned them something which isn't in the original poem. I've assigned each of them a very simple colour scheme. And basically, when one of these knights turns up, it's, okay, Aftandil, it's a name, you may remember it, you may have some difficulty remembering it at some point, but you will also, basically every time I bring Aftandil up, you'll be reminded, he's the one who dresses in green and white. And then you've got something very visual that particularly with more visual memories, can lock onto easily. Nuruddin Freedom, one of the other knights, blue and gold every time. The actual knight in the panther skin, Tariel, wears black. And a panther skin. That's also a bit of a giveaway. You don't get many people wearing panther skins. I mean, I think that's most of my original rundown, though I don't know because I wrote it in notes on the train, which I haven't managed to read this morning. Does anybody have any questions after that brief ramble? Throwing out to the floor. No is a valid answer, but...
How effective do you find when you're talking in a storytelling environment to use the use of rhyming within your stories? Is that a feature that's quite common, or is that... I almost never use rhyming unless I'm moving fully into speaking in verse. So, the very ending section of the story I just did, I essentially appended a mini poem to the end of it, what I wrote. Generally, when I'm speaking, when I'm telling it, because I'm not telling it word by word from memory. I know the sort of bones of the story. I know the plot. I mean, the names of the characters change every blooming time I tell it, because I just know this is what the plot does. I've got to I take the audience's hand, walk them through that plot. But what I really don't have at all is the idea of I'm going to use, apart from maybe some very short snippets of description, there aren't many things that repeat like that. So it's essentially, if I was going to put rhyming in, I would have to be able to work out what the rhymes were on the hoof, and that's more brain power than it's usually worth.
Do you think that modern audiences have much more trouble receiving oral stories rather than written stories due to how we are calibrated as people? Our medium is now to read.
Yeah, that's a good one. I will try and answer. Also, if you're going to Chip's talk at the end of the morning, ask him as well, because he will probably have a more interesting answer than I do, because he storytells much more professionally. I think generally, storytelling can still be effective and powerful for modern audiences. I think it possibly is more difficult. I think it's more difficult to tell extended stories. But I think with a lot of things, it's difficult to tell because so little storytelling happens. Almost the people who end up being exposed to most storytelling are storytellers and people in storytelling circles and communities. It's very rare to get storytelling at conventions, and it's even rarer to get storytelling sort of as performance style that people actually go to. I mean, there are some very good storytellers that can do much bigger performances, but they often have a bit of a twist, and they're not doing it in the same sort of traditional style. So there are some people whose storytelling is kind of a mix of traditional storytelling and more like one-person drama production. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot that can be said for storytelling, but I think actually the most important thing is that storytelling, even in a context like this, is not just an oral experience. People actually would find it, I think, much more difficult to listen to storytelling if they were just closing their eyes and listening through headphones. The fact that the storyteller is physically present is an important part of the process, because when you have a book, the author is usually narrating, and the physical book is the sort of window between you and whatever's happening in the story. When you're having a storyteller who's physically there, the fact that the storyteller is there means they're doing that. They have a sort of very active role in taking a member of the audience's hand and walking them through something. Which is why storytelling is actually very good for actually dealing with very difficult concepts and ideas, because you have someone who's actually there as the medium between you and the idea to talk you through it. If we had time, one of the other stories I do, the most grim and most sort of modern story I do, is one I wrote called The Tale of a Dying God, which is kind of a true story. It is, I wrote it after the Temple of Baal at Palmyra was blown up. And it is the story of the Temple of Palmyra from the year dot to now, as told by telling the story of Baal as a god. But that's very grim. I mean, it ends with an archaeologist getting his brains blown out with a gun, because that happened last year, or possibly the year before now, I can't remember. But yeah, but that sort of thing, actually, by taking the storyteller's attitude to it, an aspect of it, you can actually take some of these concepts and deal with them in different ways. And I think, yeah, the person being there is part of that. Right. How are we doing for time?
5 minutes. But,
Okay, good. Does anybody have anything else to query? No? Well, thank you all very much for coming. This is better attended than my talk was last year. Right, okay, thank you. Right, and I believe you're up next.
yeah, that's good.
Okay, wait till your actual start time because we'll be announcing it in the main hall. And we're announcing it on Twitter. Yeah.